Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to episode 7 of the Shon Osimbo Sports Show. I'm humbled to be here today to do this again, what I love doing. And yes, today we have another special guest, another top football commentator, all the way from the United States, but he's British, and that is Jon Champion. And I know all of you, most of you Kenyans know him, most of you Kenyan football fans, and I'm humbled to actually host him here on the show. Welcome to the program, Jon. How are you?
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. It's great to be able to come on and chat about football. I'm talking to you from Boston on the east coast of the United States, where I'm based at the moment. And it's a glorious day here. We have really bitter, hard winters here on the east coast of the United States. But so far, we've had one day of thick snow, and that's been it. So we're doing really well at the moment. It's good.
Amazing. So how's everything also there during this COVID season? I know it's a new normal. I know things have changed this 2020. Tell us about everything.
Yeah, I mean, without being too depressing about it, and obviously COVID has been dreadful news for everyone in every area of the world, the United States really hasn't dealt with it at all well. So we're now at a stage where there are 200,000 people every day being diagnosed with COVID across the country. I think nearly 3,000 people tragically lost their lives yesterday. And it's a country that, because of its constitution and these various amendments and the concept of civil liberties and freedom, have never really grasped the idea of lockdowns that maybe we've had in Europe and in some countries across Africa as well, and certainly in Australia and New Zealand. Those seem to have been the most effective tool to deal with the spread of the virus. But because of this notion of people's civil liberties not allowing any infringement of those here, and the political turmoil as well with the election and the fact that Trump is soon to be replaced by Biden, nothing has really happened. So the virus, sadly, here is running fairly rampant. We as a family have had to be particularly careful walking around. We, in the area of Boston in which we live, this is quite an international city with things like Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So there are a lot of people that have come from overseas and perhaps don't have that notion of civil liberties ingrained within them in the same way. So people here wear masks. But to give you an insight of how different it is, if you were to go to Florida or Texas, California, Georgia, it would be very different. My wife and my son and I took a trip up to New Hampshire, which is the neighboring state to Massachusetts, 5 or 6 weeks ago, and we wore our masks, and 1 or 2 people were laughing at us for doing so because the mindset is entirely different there. So this is a country that, a short answer in the end to your question, has not dealt with it very well. I'm going back to the UK next week for Christmas and New Year, and my hope and expectation is that things will be slightly better there.
Wonderful. Wow. You have gone deep into it, and thank you for that update. So let's also now bring it home to what you love, and that is football commentary. How has it been for you? You know, there was pre-COVID and now during COVID, where things you have also seen change in the football world. Tell us also about that.
Okay, well, let me give you an insight into my year, my 2020. So it started off fairly normally. It started off in the UK, calling a few Premier League games. And then I came back to the United States because the season here generally runs from March through until November. The harshness of the winter in various areas of the country here means it's not really practical to play through the deepest midwinter. So I came back and I called my first 2 games of the season in Major League Soccer, one in Los Angeles and one in Portland, Oregon. And then the virus descended. And I actually was due to have a 2-week trip back to see the rest of my family in the UK. So my wife and I got on a plane in Boston. And by the time we got off it at Heathrow, President Trump had closed the borders back to America. So we couldn't come back. So I was stranded in the UK for 3.5 months. But sadly, there was no football happening at that. And we laid low there. And eventually, I had to get a special government travel exemption to come back to start calling MLS matches again. When that league began, they had a bubble. They hosted it at Disney World in Florida. They took all the teams there, all 26 teams, and played for about 5 weeks and got their season back up and running by doing that. But such was the spread of the virus that ESPN, the company for which I work, wouldn't allow us commentators to be on site or indeed to travel on aeroplanes. So all those games were called off a TV monitor from the ESPN studios in Connecticut, about 100 miles north of New York City. So my year has been 2 games on site for the MLS in March. I called 1 game before I left the UK at Crystal Palace in the Premier League, on site, but without a crowd. And ever since then, I've done 39 matches in a row from Major League Soccer, all of them just off a TV screen. And moreover, the job here is different in that the commentator also has to host the coverage. So I've had to become a studio presenter. I've had to look presentable and reasonably tidy and buy myself a nice suit and a tie and a few new shirts. So it's been a strange experience, really. I've got 2 more games to do here in the United States. They're in the middle of their end of season playoffs at the moment that decide their league championship. And then I have a game involving the US men's national team next week. And then I get on a plane to London and go and call a few Premier League games over Christmas and New Year, which thankfully will be at the stadium. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Wow. It's called the new normal. Wow. So, yes, I'm seeing your comments coming in. Ochiwede said, learned from you, Fred. We have Mercy saying, good job, Shon. Thank you. We have Mo saying, I knew Jon championed through his voice since PlayStation 1 days before I even began taking notes of commentators. He's a legend. Big up. We have Kelvin Okwamba saying, Kazi Nzuri. And we have Chris Omanuel Cheng saying, miss his partnership with Jim Begling. We'll be coming to that later, guys. Keep on watching. So yes, back to you, Jon. They're already enjoying the show. Back to you. So I know there's also this whole concept of, most people, football is driven by the fans. And now, because of the COVID, we didn't see fans in the stadium. How was this for you? And, that whole environment, sometimes when you're commentating and you hear the fans screaming and going loud, especially when a goal goes in, how's that whole difference for you?
It's really difficult, actually. I mean, the first thing I should say is that I think we all knew how important the fans were, that they are the lifeblood of the game, but that's only been re-emphasized by their absence from stadiums for most of this calendar year. So actually commentating on games becomes, I find, more difficult, because part of my commentary style is to sit back occasionally and let the crowd do part of the work and let the match director with the cameras do part of the work. So if a great goal is scored, maybe you shout the goal scorer's name, but nothing that any commentator says at that point is going to enhance that moment further than hearing 75,000 people at Old Trafford, 50,000 people at Anfield, 60,000 at the Emirates, wherever it may be, screaming their heads off in delight or despair at that goal having been scored, whether it's been for or against their team. So suddenly you find that you have to fill some of those spaces. You have to talk at times when maybe you don't feel comfortable talking. And then the other thing that's happened is that some broadcasters have opted to use the fake crowd noise to augment the atmosphere within a stadium. But that's never going to be anywhere near as good. So you'll hear a near miss or watch a near miss on the television. And sometimes you'll hear the crowd surge as if it's been a goal because the guy that's controlling the audio has mistakenly thought it is a goal. So you have crazy moments like that, even in the Premier League, where they're very good at doing things such as that. So it's been a frustrating, difficult year in terms of commentating, because I don't think any of us have been able to commentate in the normal way that we really enjoy. And that's largely down to the absence of the fans.
Yes. And I know I want to know more about you, but let's read some of the memories. I know we have Shukri Wachu. He's talking about one of the legendary commentary, and this was during Terry Henry's second debut in an FA game, Cup game, that is against Leeds in 2012. How was that atmosphere, he's asking, and what was going through your mind when Thierry scored? Because this is what you say. You said he may be cast in bronze, but is still capable of producing truly golden moments.
Oh, well, let me tell you about the sort of genesis for that. So that was a time when Thierry Henry, having left Arsenal some years before, had been brought back by Arsene Wenger. He'd been and played in Barcelona, and then he actually moved to the United States to play for the New York Red Bulls. And they loaned him back to Arsenal during their winter break. And he came back slightly older, slightly heavier, slightly slower, but still unmistakably a fantastic footballer. And I can give you a bit of insight into this because Thierry Henry is someone that I've worked with on TV, and he's also a manager in Major League Soccer. He's the manager of Montreal, one of the 3 Canadian clubs. So I've had the chance to chat to him about this, because that goal is one of the most replayed Arsenal goals ever, certainly of the modern era. And he said that that's the most significant goal he ever scored for Arsenal, because he proved to himself that he could still do it at a high level. So it was a Monday night game. It was an FA Cup tie against Leeds United, who came from the Championship, 1 division down. And I don't pre-plan things generally. I think that football commentating has to be a spontaneous act, because football is such a spontaneous sport. But as I walked into the ground, I walked past the newly unveiled statue of Thierry Henry. Arsenal are very good at having statues of their great players and great managers spread around the perimeter of the Emirates Stadium. And I walked past for the first time the Henry statue. So I didn't give it a second thought other than to admire it. But then when he scored that goal, it just suddenly came into my head that here's a guy who is so revered here that his statue is already outside the ground, not with him being an old man, but with him still being capable of scoring a truly golden goal as he did there. So that's where the line came from, really. But I was intrigued and slightly surprised as well, because it was an FA Cup tie, to hear that of all the 200 plus goals that he scored for Arsenal, that's the one that Thierry Henry looks back on with the greatest joy.
Wow. So let's just, this is beautiful and this is wonderful, the way you even explain it, the passion behind it. So let's take it back. Who is Jon Champion and how did you get into football commentary?
Goodness. I mean, where do I start? So I come from a city called York in the north of England. It's about 200 miles north of London. I wasn't very good at doing anything at school. I was horribly bad at doing exams. And so I got to the age of 19 and I left school and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I loved sport, wasn't very good at playing it, but loved watching it both in the flesh and on TV. I used to go and watch my local club, York City, who are now in the 6th division or the 6th tier of English football, but have been as high as the Championship in the past. And I was captivated by that. And the one sport that I could play reasonably well was cricket. And I played in a cricket match one day at the age of 19, having left school, not knowing what I wanted to do. I decided I wanted to go traveling to buy myself some time. So I got myself a job at the British Lending Library, which is a big, august institution in the north of England, which serves academics right around the world if they needed pre-internet an article from a magazine or a periodical for their research. They would contact this lending institution in the UK, and someone like me would have to go to the shelf, find the article or the book, take it to a photocopying machine, copy it, put it in an envelope and send it off to wherever in the world it might be. So this is a long way of explaining that I decided I would get a job for 6 months to earn enough money to go traveling for 6 months. So I did this. And halfway through, I played in a cricket match one day, just for my local club in York. And I got a few runs and I retired to the bar afterwards. And I was halfway through my second large glass of, not of water, but of beer, when the phone rang. This was before mobile phones as well. This was 1984. Phone rang in the corner of the clubhouse. And it was the local radio station wanting to interview me about my innings that day. So fortified by the beer, I answered the questions of the presenter on the telephone, put the phone down at the end, went and had a few more beers, had a very good night, and thought no more about it. And 2 weeks later, there was a phone call at home, and it was the sports editor of this newly established BBC local radio station saying that they enjoyed my interview. I'd sounded very fluent. Well, you bet I'd sounded fluent probably because of the beer. They were looking for some people to report on rugby and football that winter because they were just setting up a sports department. He went on to say, there's no real money in it, but it might be good fun. We think you'd be quite good at it. Do you fancy it? Well, I had nothing better to do. And so I did it. And again, didn't really give it a second thought. 6 weeks more down the line, there was another phone call at home. And this time it was the manager of the radio station saying, hey, we think you've got something. You sound very natural on the air. Are you enjoying it? And I said, I'm having a great time. Yeah, it doesn't seem very difficult, this at all. And he said, well, we think you've got a chance of making a career out of this. But if you want to join the BBC, you need to be a university graduate. So you need to find yourself a course, doesn't matter what the course is, to go on for 3 years, just to grow up a bit, mature, have that academic rigor of being a graduate. We'll give you work at weekends. The money will help supplement your student grant. And as long as you train on and develop, we'll give you a job at the end of it. And that's what happened. So at about 2 weeks' notice, I managed to scramble onto a college course in Leeds. And it had a snappy title. It was Communication and Cultural Studies with Public Media, which these days would be a media degree. But it was designed around elements of psychology and sociology and a little bit of media as well. And it was at a Catholic teacher training college. And I wasn't brought up a Catholic, but within a week, I knew the lyrics to every song by the Pogues, the Irish folk band. And the BBC were right. It was a great growing up experience. And I was doing this work at weekends. They were giving me more and more to do. And about a year in, they were actually offering me jobs saying, look, leave the university now and come and work for us. But I thought it was better to get the qualification. So I stayed on. And then 6 weeks before my finals, there was a phone call from a very prim and proper lady called Miss Jackson. And the phone call went something like this. Lifted the phone. Hello, Mr. Champion. I said, yes. It's Miss Jackson from the Human Resources Department of the British Broadcasting Corporation, Portland Place, London, W1. So I was immediately quite taken aback by this. And I said, Miss Jackson, it's very nice to talk to you. How can I help you today? It's about the job, she said. I said, the job? Yes, the job. I said, you're going to have to enlighten me because no one's spoken to me about the job. Well, no one's been in touch with you about the job. I said, no, I'm afraid they haven't. Well, there's a post, I believe it's in the north of England, for a sports reporter with the BBC in Leeds. We put you down for an interview on Friday at 3:00. These are the questions we're going to ask you, and these are the answers we would like you to produce, she said very sternly down the phone. 3:00 Friday, don't forget to wear a tie. So basically, I can now say 35 years on, it was a setup. They wanted me. They told me the jobs for the interview panel. They said what answers they wanted me to produce. So I parroted these answers out and hey presto, I got the job, and they held it open until I'd finished my university exams. And I was off and running in local radio. I did that for 2 years. Then I was offered a job by national radio, which was a great thrill, going to work for the BBC in London, presenting their Saturday afternoon sports program and Sports Report, the program that many of your listeners and viewers may have heard on the World Service over the years, where I used to introduce James Alexander Gordon to read the football results at 5:00 UK time every Saturday. So that was great. And they sent me very quickly to my first World Cup. At the age of 25, I went to Italia 90. That's the first of what I've been lucky enough to do 8 World Cups so far. And they would send me to the Olympic Games. I went to the Barcelona Olympics, the Sydney Olympics, and the Atlanta Olympics as well in the middle. And then 4 or 5 years further down the line, I was commentating for national BBC radio at Selhurst Park the night that Eric Cantona jumped into the crowd. I don't know whether you recall that incident, but it's an infamous moment in Premier League history from 1995 where Cantona was playing for Manchester United and a yob, a thug in the crowd, was shouting dreadful abuse at him. And he was sent off in the game, and he just snapped as he walked along the touchline. And this guy was shouting all sorts of obscenities at him. So he just took off 2-footed over the advertising hoarding with his boots first and landed with his boots in the chest of this guy who was called Matthew Simmons. And
the picture is still, yes.
I have been doing the radio for the BBC and listening, lying in his bath in his posh apartment in London, was the head of television sport at the BBC. And they had a legendary commentator called John Motson, who'd been doing the job for many, many years. And in fact, he only recently retired, but they were going to give him a year's sabbatical. They needed a younger commentator to come in and work on the very, iconic TV show Match of the Day, which is how the BBC shows the Premier League. And so off the back of that commentary, I was offered the chance to do a year with Match of the Day, and that then became a permanent job. And I did 5 or 6 years with the BBC. They then lost all their football rights to broadcast because they were outbid by the commercial sector. So I moved across to work for ITV, which is the main commercial station in the UK, doing the Premier League and the Champions League. And from there, it led to Setanta and ESPN, who both broadcast live Premier League matches, and all the while working as well for the Premier League on the live broadcast of Premier League fixtures, which is what your viewers in Kenya would have probably seen me on many times over the years. So that's my synopsis. And then 2 years ago, I was offered a job in the United States to come and work for ESPN, which is the biggest sports broadcaster in the world, doing their football coverage, or soccer, as we have to learn to call it here. I just decided that I'd done the job in the UK at the top level. I've been very fortunate for a long, long time. And whatever I continued to do there wouldn't be any different to anything I'd done before. So I just thought I was at an age where I had time to step away, come to the United States. If it works really well, then I stay. If it doesn't, I've still got years of my career when I could come back to the UK. So that's where I'm at, really. I'm in my second year in the United States doing something completely different.
I think we can cheers to that. To a very good. So yes, that is so wonderful. You need to see our producer Ed. He's just like, wow. I can see him behind the scenes. He's so jazzed about everything. So yes, let me take you back to your Premier League days. What are your best memories from the Premier League? Some of those memories you can't forget about.
There are so many, and that's one of the great appeals and joys of the Premier League, that whether it's the best league in the world or not in terms of the quality, people can have that debate. There's a good argument that it is. But in terms of entertainment, it is unrivaled, and it throws up so many storylines and memorable games. So I look back And I was covering top division football in England before the Premier League. So I suppose I have the complete spectrum to look at. So I go back to the mid-1990s and to that wonderful Newcastle side that Kevin Keegan had, the Cavaliers. They played the most outlandishly, outrageously entertaining football. And they so nearly won the league. They so nearly knocked Manchester United, who were then the top dogs, off their perch. And integral to that were two classic games, which both ended 4-3 against Newcastle, both against Liverpool at Anfield. And the drama of those games, if anyone looks them up on YouTube, you'll see Stan Collymore in stoppage time score a winning goal for Liverpool against Newcastle. And Kevin Keegan, the Newcastle manager, knows that that is the moment when the title has slipped away, and he drapes himself over the advertising board at the side of Anfield, which was the club where he played most famously as well. So moments like that stick in the memory. I commentated on the first ever Premier League goal scored by Brian Deane for Sheffield United against Manchester United at Bramall Lane. I did that for the radio. I have memories of going to Southampton to watch Matthew Le Tissier when he was nothing short of a genius. And every time we would turn up on a Sunday afternoon to do the worldwide broadcast of a Southampton game, and it seemed like, it wasn't the case, but it seemed that every week Le Tissier would outdo himself by scoring another remarkable world-class goal. So I have those memories. Nearer to the present day, lots of people talk to me about a 4-4 draw at Anfield between Liverpool and Arsenal when Andrei Arshavin scored all 4 goals. And I also remember being at Selhurst Park the night when Liverpool seemed like they were going to end their title drought. This was the game before Steven Gerrard's infamous slip against Chelsea. But to me, the fact that they let slip a 3-goal lead late in a game at Crystal Palace was the thing that really did for their title challenge that year. Things like Manchester City scoring 6 at Old Trafford, the arrival of the noisy neighbours, that sticks in the mind as well. I could bore you all day long with memories, but those are the ones off the top of my head that really stick with me, I think.
Yes, and your commentary work has stood out over the years, and we've even seen some of the lines our fans are already writing and just talking about them. So tell us the secret behind these creative lines. And also we have, let me just put another question from a viewer here, Ochiweda, also asking, how have you been able to memorize the players' names and their former clubs and stuff like that? So what is the secret behind your creativity, Jon?
I don't know about the creativity. I think it comes back to the point I made earlier that I believe that broadcasting on sports, commentating on sports, is very much a spontaneous act. So I never have anything written down in front of me that is a line that I might deliver. I rely on something coming into my mind in the moment, because I think that's the best way to reflect the moment. In terms of being ready, recognizing the players, it's an awful lot of preparation. So probably to prepare properly for a game, you need to do a good 2 days of solid preparation. It becomes a little easier if you're covering that team and those players on a regular basis, because you come to recognize them. I end up studying a lot of videos. I keep notes. I don't know how well I can show you this, but I keep a book, which I have about 25 years worth of these. These are handwritten.
Wow.
I don't know how well it will show up, but I keep a book like that.
Yes, we can see that. Oh, wow.
So that's my unfolding page on Liverpool this season. It shows all the players, where they've played, in which position, little notes on things that have happened in the game, if they've been booked, if they've been substituted, if there's been a particular goal scored that is of note, the attendance in the good days when we have crowds. So I have about 25 years worth of these books, which are an invaluable tool, because I can go back, say I'm doing Manchester United against Leeds, which is a game I am calling for the worldwide Premier League broadcast just before Christmas. I'll be able to go back through those books and see what's happened in previous fixtures between Manchester United and Leeds, which is obviously one of the most fevered Premier League rivalries over the years, although it's not been a thing for a rather too long now, but it's back. So there's great value in that. And then I have all my notes as well. I mean, I've got some MLS notes in front of me at the moment for the game. I call the game a playoff game between Orlando and New England at the weekend. So, those are my sort of commentary notes for that. And for a Premier League game, they would probably be even more detailed. And then you have sort of supplementary notes behind as well about the managers and the various players. So it's not, I think what I'm trying to say is that commentating on a match is not something where you just turn up with a microphone and you get the team sheet and then you shout the names of the players. There's a little bit more goes on in terms of preparation, but I come back to that idea of spontaneity, because I think if someone scores a wonderful goal and I go looking for a piece of paper in front of me thinking, what shall I say now? What did I plan to say if Harry Kane scored a marvellous goal for Tottenham? That's not going to work. The thing that comes into my head to reflect the moment is going to be the most effective way of doing it, I think.
Yes, and I think that's wonderful to tell our viewers, because I know most of them think, oh, maybe it's not random and all that, but it's beautiful to see, and they've seen at least the papers and the work that go into it. Now, let's talk about your partnership with Jim Begling. I have heard this a million times. People keep on telling me, the moment I talk to Jim, Jon Champion, the name Jon Champion has to appear somewhere in the comments. So yes, tell us about that partnership and how it came to be and how you enjoyed it during the Premier League days.
Well, I miss him. I miss Jim. We still talk quite a bit, and he has a sister who lives quite close to me here in Massachusetts on the east coast of the United States. But Jim is great. We first worked together shortly after his career had been ended by a dreadful broken leg in a Merseyside derby at Goodison Park one night. He was the victim of a horrendous tackle, and although he came back and played, he was then loaned out by Liverpool to Leeds United, to Plymouth. And I think he developed knee trouble because of the broken leg and the compensations in his body. And so his career was over in his mid-20s. And this was a guy who was destined to be Liverpool's starting left back for 10, 15 years. He would have won all sorts of medals. And that was sadly taken from him. And a guy got hold of him when he was wondering what he was going to do next. I don't know how much of this he may well have explained all of this to you.
Yes.
But he was wondering what he was going to do with his life. And his local TV company, Granada Television, based in Manchester, was run by a man called Paul Doherty, whose father, Peter, was perhaps Northern Ireland's most famous ever footballer. He played at a World Cup for them in the 1950s. That's a by the by. But this guy, Paul Doherty, identified in Jim potentially a very good co-commentator and broadcaster. And he worked on him and trained him. And before long, Jim was invited to do radio commentaries. And this would be about 1990, 1991. And those were with the BBC. So it meant that he and I worked together for the first time nearly 30 years ago. And then when I moved to ITV to do the TV in 2001, Jim was already working for them. So I think the first TV commentary that we did together there was actually the day of 9/11. We were doing a Champions League game in Mallorca. And I remember sitting in a cafe during the afternoon with these dreadful pictures from New York City of the planes going into the Twin Towers, and Jim and I discussing whether our first TV match together was actually going to happen. Mallorca were playing Arsenal. It did go ahead. Arsenal lost and Ashley Cole got sent off. Those are my memories. But that was the start of a TV relationship that endures to this day. I haven't had it confirmed yet, but I would hope that one or two of my games over Christmas may be with Jim again. He reached out last week to ask me whether that was going to be the case. But quite often the bosses don't tell us whether we're working together. The day before, when you've got your travel sheet saying what time you need to be there, and only at that point do you learn who you're working with. So, but I very much hope it will be. So, yes, Jim and I had time at ITV, and then with the Premier League World Feed as well. That's us with Michael Buffer, the man, let's get ready to rumble. That was before a game at Chelsea, shortly before I left for the United States a couple of years ago. And Chelsea had brought in Michael Buffer. There'd been a big boxing fight the night before in London. And I think HBO, the American broadcasters, had brought him over, and Chelsea, off the back of that, had hired him to announce the teams when they ran out of the tunnel at Stamford Bridge before a big Premier League game. So Jim and I were introduced to Michael Buffer before kickoff, which was a big thrill as well. But Jim is great. And it comes back to the point of spontaneity in terms of reacting, because his is a more tactical analysis than mine. But he will also arrive with sheets of notes that he's prepared. So he knows all the little angles, all the background, the context of every game. And I think critically, he understands that the role of the co-commentator is not to repeat what the commentator has just said, but to augment, to provide something different, to answer the question, why did something happen and how did it happen? I can deal with what. He, with his insight as a former professional player, can deal with areas that I'm not qualified to deal in and take you behind the scenes. And I always think the mark of the best co-commentators, if I'm sitting watching a game at home, I want them to tell me things that I, even as an experienced football watcher, haven't noticed in a game.
Yes, and you left him in the safe hands of Peter Drury, who is also a very good close friend of yours. Tell us about that, and also, and as we were talking, and I told you that 3 big football commentators in Kenya who are well known in Kenya, John Champion, Jim Beglin, and Peter Drury. And the most beautiful thing is that all the three of you are actually friends. Tell us everything about Peter and yes.
Well, I've known Peter as long as I've known Jim, so probably 30 years. We're actually godfathers to each other's children. And we worked together at that radio station I told you about in Leeds, my first job. About 18 months into that job, we were looking for a young broadcaster to bring in. And so I was sort of part of the process by which Peter got his foot up on the ladder with the BBC there. Then about a year after I'd moved to work for National Radio, Peter moved there. When I went to ITV, he was already at ITV. So our careers have converged an awful lot. We're only a couple of years different in terms of age, and our families know each other very well. And Jim is part of that circle as well. So Jim, I think, always claims that he sees more of Peter than he sees of his wife these days. I can relate to that feeling as well from my days on the road covering the Premier League.
Yes, he's saying that too. Amazing. And I love the close-knit family and friendship because it just shows you how this, when you guys are together, how the football commentary world has grown and everyone enjoys listening to the three of you. Now, before we talk about your move to the MLS, and I know so many people have questions about that, which you have to answer, let's bring in a local commentator. His name is Jason Sagini, a very huge fan of yours. And let me give him the floor to ask you his questions.
Jason, hello. Nice to talk to you. How are you?
Hello, John. Thank you very much, Shon, for inviting me here to speak to one of the biggest commentators in Kenya and one of our mentors and someone who we look up to as aspiring football commentators. My name is Jason Sagini, also known as the Sports Archbishop, and it's a pleasure also meeting you, John, wherever you are.
It's great to meet you, Jason, and I'm delighted to hear that you are an enthusiastic commentator because we need lots of good commentators.
Yes. So I know I got only a few minutes here before I leave you with the conversation here. So my first question comes in from one of the principles of football commentary, where a football commentator needs not to take any sides or be biased in any football match. So I want to know, can you share with us that instance where the fans of a certain club felt like you are not fair to them, but instead you are very fair to the opponents? When was it, and how does one deal with such situations as a football commentator?
I think you've got to have a thick skin, Jason. I think you can't be swayed too easily by what people say, particularly in this age of social media. And maybe I benefit from the fact that in my formative years, when I was forming my style and making my first steps as a commentator, social media didn't really exist. So it wasn't a distraction. I do think it's all too easy. While social media is very important and in many ways a wonderful thing, it's also a place where people can sound off very easily, and a place where people generally, they are committed fans of a club or another. So we were talking about Jim and Peter Drury and myself. All of us are very used to coming away from a broadcast of a Premier League game, and we get accused of being biased. But we're being accused by fans of both clubs. So we usually think that if both clubs think that we are biased against their teams, we must be doing something reasonably right. We must be somewhere near the middle ground. But certainly with the BBC training that I had and Peter had and Jim Beglin had, we were taught that there is no room for bias in sports commentary. You always have to be straight down the middle, see both sides. And I think if you do that, you will inevitably be accused of being biased. But I think we all look very carefully. We're our own biggest critics. So I think if there was ever a danger of us overstepping a mark and showing favour to one side or another, we would very quickly realise and step back. But I can honestly say to you, Jason, that it's almost the most important thing about our existence as sport commentators, that we are unbiased and we just call the games. We're not calling the teams, we're calling the game and how the game unfolds, rather than majoring on an issue for one side or another side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My second and last question comes to, or rather goes to aspiring commentators. Now, John, do you have a mentorship program or a plan for aspiring commentators? And if you have one, how can one join? And what do you intend to do there?
I don't have a formal mentorship program. What I tend to find is that quite often broadcasters take on a young commentator and they want them to be trained or guided So, for example, I was contacted by Amazon recently, who have the rights to the Champions League in Germany, to say, could I help one of their young commentators that they're trying to groom and help to improve? So I'm doing a few sessions with him at the moment, and that's been the case with some of the young British commentators as well. When they've been up and coming, they will reach out to someone like myself or to Peter Drury or one or two of the other commentators just to say, do you have any advice on a particular area? But I think commentating has to be a very personal thing, Jason. So you could look at me, you could look at Peter, you could say, I think, Peter is fantastic, or I really like John, or whatever it might be. But ultimately, your style needs to be your style. So you can take the good things that you hear from Peter, or from me, or from Martin Tyler, or whoever it might be. But there needs to be good things from Jason as well in there. So you've got to be big and bold enough to say that ultimately you're going to be Jason, the commentator, not a little bit of John, not a little bit of Peter. There's no point trying to model yourself entirely. Take the good things, ignore the bad things, which we all have. We all have bad habits, and then mold your own way forward. So in answer to your question, I don't have a formal mentorship program, but what does happen is that once broadcasters have developed to a certain level, sometimes their parent companies will get in touch and say, can you provide a bit of guidance?
Thanks a lot. I've learned a few, and thanks a lot to Shon Osimbo for that moment of fame.
Jason, it's a thrill to talk to you, and I wish you the very best of luck, because it's a wonderful way of making a living. It's far better than having a proper job.
Thank you so much, and continue doing the good work that you're doing.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you so much, Jason. You said it's better than having a proper job. It is a proper job, a very proper job, John. Anyway,
what I mean is, it's not like having to turn up at an office at 8 o'clock in the morning and be there for 9 hours. So every day is different doing this job, which is wonderful.
Yes, and I know when the world recovers from everything from COVID, I think it's also beautiful, when you travel stadium to stadium, meeting different people, seeing how different fans relate. It's a good job. It's a beautiful job. Now, let's talk about this, John. Moving to the Major League Soccer, moving to the United States. I remember seeing some stuff online. Everyone was like, he's in his prime. He's doing his thing. England has the best, football league in the world. Who would move from the Premier League all the way to the MLS, to a country? And I love my people in the United States who call football soccer. John.
All very fair points. Fair points. But I've always liked a challenge. And I just wanted to do something for a period of time that would make me think differently. So I was in the very privileged position, having done top-level British European football for well over 30 years, where I kind of knew all the people, I knew all the managers. I could get information very easily. And I was covering stories like Manchester United's struggles, for example. If I was doing the Premier League at the moment, I'd probably be covering do we need to sack the Manchester United manager? Where on earth do they go next? For about the 6th time. Mm-hmm. And after a while, that loses a little bit of its luster. And yes, there are always new storylines coming into the Premier League. But I just thought, what will it be like? I'm 55 now. So I hopefully got another 20 years of doing this. Martin Tyler is 75, to put that into some sort of context, and he's still doing it. So I didn't think that by signing to work in America for 5 years and experience something very different, to have a new challenge, to have to think about things in a different way, I didn't necessarily think I was walking away from the Premier League forever at the age that I did it. And that's one of the reasons that I've done it now, because I think if I'd left it another 5-10 years, then probably I would have walked away and not had the opportunity to go back. Here, I've got the best of both worlds, because if this is a runaway success in America and there is the chance to extend my stay, then we'll talk about it. If there isn't, and I feel that going back to the Premier League is the best way forward, then I'll try and explore that. Now, it may be that other commentators will have come in and done such a good job that that opportunity won't be there, but that's a risk that you take. I just think when I finally close the book on my commentating career, hopefully in 20 odd years' time, I'll be able to say I've had a breadth and range of experience that very few other broadcasters have been lucky enough to have. So that's the reasoning behind it. I accept that the Premier League is the premier product on which to work. I'm fortunate that occasionally I can still return to the UK and do that and remind myself of what it's like. And in the meantime, both I and my family get a totally different experience. And let's not forget, life is about not just football, whilst football is a massive part of it for all of us, but it's about the broader life experience and the cultural experiences. And frankly, the thought that I've lived in America through the chaos of the latter part of the Trump years, of an election campaign and a pandemic, I've got a bit more than I bargained for, really, by moving across the Atlantic. But it's all part of that rich tapestry of life, as they say. So I view it through that lens, really.
Yes. And any major differences in terms of commentating, comparing, that is England to the United States?
Yeah, huge differences. The first one is the one that I alluded to earlier. I have to be the presenter as well. So I've learned to have to wear makeup, which is very new for me, and to look smart, and to learn the discipline, which you will understand, of being in a television studio and knowing which camera to look at and how the director is working. That's alien to me, because my job has always just been to commentate on matches, not to have to sort of look pretty and smile at the camera at the right time. So I've had a crash course in that, and I've had to teach myself. So that's been one of those challenges. That's been something I've had to set in front of myself at an age when most people are beginning to think, I think I know what I'm doing. Now I'm putting myself in a position of discomfort on occasions where, frankly, I don't know what I'm doing. Now, set against that, there is also the different style of broadcasting in the United States, the fact that everything is sponsored. So I have to be on top of all the sponsorships, the commercials, the advertising side of it. And as the presenter, you're doing a lot of that too. You have to be cognizant that the audience is different and is used to a very different style of commentating. So my sort of more reserved style, where I like to let the picture tell the story and the crowd do the work, is very different to your NFL or baseball or basketball commentators here who talk all the time. So I'm a very different animal, and not everyone likes that. So it's been a joy, really, to work with a different team who have a different mindset, but yet are willing to take on board some of my experiences from so many years of doing the job, and think that maybe there are ways in which they can change, but I have to change as well. And hopefully the result of that, working for a big broadcaster like ESPN, is better football coverage at the end of it.
Yes, and many football fans outside the United States are trying to understand the format when it comes to Major League Soccer. Major League Soccer, because it's not the same as the other formats of league, win teams, relegated, promoted. Yes. So briefly, can you just tell us about that? Because in the MLS we have the playoffs and final series. Yes.
Absolutely. So because we are in America, American sports are sorted out not by a 34-game league, they're sorted out by playoffs. It's how it is. It's how the Super Bowl is sorted out. It's how the NBA playoffs are sorted out. I'm sure all your viewers and listeners are well aware of that. And so because soccer, to use the American name, is relatively recent here, the league only set up in 1996, so this is the 25th season. And at the moment, I don't think they feel confident enough to stand on their own 2 feet and say, right, we're going to settle this by dint of a league. We need playoffs at the moment because it appeals to the American sporting psyche. So at the moment we have playoffs. We're in the midst of those playoffs. We're 4 games of the season. MLS Cup, which is the Super Bowl of American soccer, happens a week on Sunday. In terms of relegation, it's very difficult because to get a club in Major League Soccer, you need a billionaire. So to buy into Major League Soccer, to get a franchise, as they would call it, is about $400 million. So it's very difficult to persuade someone who's signed a check for $400 million, plus that's the franchise fee, plus the money to buy the players, plus you have to have a soccer-specific stadium that you need to build from scratch. So you're probably in for $650, $700 million. How do you say to that investor, oh, by the way, if you have a bad first season, you could be relegated from this league that you've just paid $700 million to join? I think, and I might well be put up against the wall and thumped regally by longer-term American soccer supporters, I think eventually promotion and relegation will come here, because I think the sport needs that jeopardy, which is one of the things that the European leagues thrive on, particularly the Premier League. But they're not at that point yet. I think they'll get there, but they're getting to the stage now. There are 26 clubs in Major League Soccer. In 2 years' time, there'll be 30. So there's almost enough for 2 divisions then. So teams that are relegated wouldn't actually be relegated from Major League Soccer. They'd just be relegated from the top division to the second division with the opportunity to come back. And maybe then the conversation could be had a little more sensibly about promotion and relegation.
Yes, when you're talking about the numbers, I was like, David Beckham, Inter Miami. Wow. The numbers.
Yeah. Well, you see, when he signed his deal to play with LA Galaxy, one of the biggest carrots that they offered him was the thought that he could have part of a Major League Soccer franchise as part of his deal if he agreed to come and play for 5 years in LA, which he did. And at the time, that was thought to be worth about $25 million. It's worth an awful lot more than that now. But the other thing I should say on MLS, Shon, actually, just briefly on this, because I know we've got a lot of other ground to get through and a lot of topics, is that I think if people scratch beneath the surface of Major League Soccer, it's not the sort of plastic creation that it was in the early years when they couldn't have draws and they'd have strange penalty shootouts that started with players running from the halfway line. That's all gone years ago. What we now have is not the retirement league that Beckham came to in his 30s. What we have is a league where there are a lot of good young American and South American players coming through. People like Almiron, who's now moved, the Paraguayan, moved to Newcastle in the Premier League. There's a couple of other guys. There's one called Diego Rossi, playing with LAFC, a Uruguayan, who's going to be moving to Europe very shortly, I think. Several others in that category too. And the business model for Major League Soccer has moved from buying European players at the tail end of their careers. Yes, there are still one or two. Higuain has just arrived. Blaise Matuidi, a World Cup winner, has come to Beckham's Inter Miami. But now the business model is find a good young Argentine or Brazilian or Uruguayan, buy them cheap, let them play in the improved structure of Major League Soccer for 3 years, and then sell them for big money to Europe. And the stated aim is that Major League Soccer will become a top 5 world league. That's probably 10 years away, but they will get there because the Americans do, ultimately. They'll only accept the top standard, and they recognize it's a growing product at the moment. It will get there. And the other big thing on the horizon here is that they're co-hosting the World Cup in 2026, which will be another major step forward for the sport, I think.
Wow, wonderful. So what are some of the things you love about Major League Soccer?
I like the fact that it's a growing product. So I was lucky enough to grow through the rapid development of the Premier League from its inception in 1992, the metamorphosis from the old First Division, which we loved, but it wasn't glitzy or glamorous. And suddenly this new product, which was effectively the First Division with new clothes on, came in. And it's got to the stage now where it's overtaken so many other sporting competitions and is vying, I suppose, with the NFL at the very top of the sporting structure. And there is the same potential for Major League Soccer. And having been excited to go through the journey with the Premier League, I now have the opportunity to go through a similar journey with Major League Soccer. So I like that. And I also think that the positivity that Americans have towards their sport. So this glass here, if that was in the UK, we'd be describing that as a quarter empty. Here in America, it's 3/4 full. It's just a different mindset. And they look at things with a view to what is possible from this sports league rather than what's wrong with it. So I quite like that as well. The other thing I'd say is that in the wider American football, soccer sense, look around Europe at the moment at the Americans who are making waves. And this is with reference to the World Cup in 2026. Pulisic at Chelsea, Gio Reyna at Dortmund, people like Tyler Adams making waves in the Champions League with Leipzig, 2 Barcelona players from America, Dest and De La Fuente, Weston McKennie playing regularly for Juventus, and a host more arriving from Major League Soccer who've come through the MLS academies. This is an exciting place to be and will be for the next 10 years or so as this wave of good young players come through.
Wow, wonderful. Let me just get one comment before we move on. And we have Athens Women's Football Summit that I actually work for. They are one of the founders is based in the United States. And I also got to talk about how women's football is actually a huge deal in the United States. United States are supporting women's football. And that was so beautiful to just talk to the agents and everyone involved, saying thank you, Shon and John, for this fantastic conversation. John, we love watching / listening to you. You're a legend. So that's what they're saying. So thank you so much, Marius, for that. And yeah, so just quickly, I have to throw this in there before we continue with MLS, but just that support we've seen, because, you know, everyone is now jumping on the women's football bandwagon at this moment. But we've seen what the United States has done for women's football, and it's so beautiful, John. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that if you put a women's football international on the television in the United States, it gets about 4 or 5 times the audience of a men's football international. So that's the degree to which the US women's team has been taken to the public's hearts here. And of course, Americans love winners. That's part of their psyche as well. They love themselves to winners. And the US women are the best team in the world and have been on and off since 1999 when they lifted the World Cup. I think of slightly greater concern is the development of the league. I thought it was intriguing to see several players from the Professional American League actually ending up playing in the UK during the the close season, including Alex Morgan, who's the poster girl, if you like, for the US women's national team, who's temporarily playing with Tottenham. But it's very exciting, and the viewing figures for the professional women's league here are very good as well. Yeah. So I think there's less of a battle for women's football here than there is for the men's game, strangely, which is, I know, a different way around to many countries around the world, but those battles were fought by the women here 20, 25 years ago and largely won as well.
Yes, wonderful. I hope other countries can learn from the United States when it comes to women's football. Now, let's go to a Kenyan player and some Kenyan players. Let's now start with the main face, because he is the captain of the Kenya national team, and that is Victor Wanyama, who made his move from Tottenham Hotspur in the UK all the way to Montreal Impact, that is in Canada. How did he adapt to the MLS, John?
He adapted well because he's such a good player. They're playing him in a defensive midfield role, so he has the majority of the game ahead of him. Obviously, he's come at a good age as well. He's still only 29, and he's playing for a manager that he knows in Thierry Henry, who appreciates him. I think on the debit side, the problems of going to Montreal is that they're not one of the strongest teams at the moment. They have the potential to be, with Thierry Henry at the helm, but they just released a number of players. This is the time when MLS players allow the players out of contract to go or to re-sign them. It's a much more fragile world than the big European clubs, where maybe you sign a 4 or 5 year deal. But if you're a designated player, one of those special big names brought in like Victor Wanyama, then you are on a long-term contract. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see his impact on the impact of Montreal over the next four seasons, which I think is the length of the deal that he signed. But it's another good sign that a player of his caliber thinks in the prime of his career that it's worth coming to Major League Soccer, and he's been a very welcome addition.
Amazing. Dixon Wambugu says, this guy is a genius. He has everything at his fingertips, pure class, as he puts it. And then we have Jason, who has come to comment again, says, apart from commentary, John seems to be a very good comedian.
Probably not intentionally. But you know what, Shon, to be fair to the Kenyan representation in MLS, these two guys will be very angry if I don't mention them. We should mention Buana, who came through at Seattle, played for them as they won MLS Cup last year, the ultimate prize, and has since moved to Nashville, who are one of the new expansion teams, they call them, a team in their first season, who've just been knocked out of the playoffs, but they've done really well. And also there's a guy called Lawrence Olam, who's been a long-term Major League Soccer stalwart. I think he won 4 caps for the national team, still playing in the second division of American soccer with Miami FC, and he's made a big impact on MLS over the years. So they deserve a mention in this conversation as well.
Yes, so Kenyans are doing big things in the United States. So yes, let's just continue. So which team has impressed you so far this season in the MLS?
There've been a number, not necessarily the ones we would expect. I think everyone was looking forward to seeing David Beckham's Inter Miami at the start of the season. And yet they became the first new team ever to lose their first 5 games in Major League Soccer. So that wasn't an auspicious start. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. And towards the end of the season, they began to hit their straps, bringing in Gonzalo Higuain and Blaise Matuidi and 1 or 2 others. And I think there'll be a force going forward because there'll be other big name signings coming in. But the best team so far this year, really, the most consistent team, has been Seattle, who are the reigning MLS Cup champions. And they are an unfussy side. They've got a very good Uruguayan called Nico Ladero, who's their playmaker. They're easy on the eye. They're efficient. They've got a very good coach in a man called Brian Schmetzer. And I think they'll take some beating in the remainder of the playoffs. The side that actually won the regular season was Philadelphia for the first time in their history. And they're very well coached. They've got some good, slightly lower profile European players. And they've also produced some excellent young Americans. There's one called Brendan Aronson, who's only 20 years of age, who's about to join Salzburg, who are doing reasonably well in the Champions League. He's joining them in January. So Philadelphia were, I suppose, by the traditional measure of the rest of the world, which is how many points do you get over the league season, they were the best team, in fact, but then they go and lose in the playoffs, which is the pitfalls of the system here. Last year was the same. LAFC, managed by Bob Bradley, who for a brief spell had a time in the Premier League in charge of Swansea. They were by a margin the best team, but then tripped themselves up in the playoffs. So they won the Supporters' Shield, which is the equivalent of the league title, but that's not regarded as the ultimate prize.
Wow. Let's also talk about just one player that is from Minnesota FC, Osvaldo Alonso. This is a player who is close to one of former Kenyan players, that is David Kenga. And David was Thank you, David, for sending this picture to us ahead of the interview. There they are, and I know, John, you've also commentated most of his games. Tell us about Osvaldo Alonso.
Well, Ozzy Alonso, as he's affectionately known, is a Cuban by birth, and he was a Cuban international. And you'll appreciate the difficulties for people living in Cuba over the years, and many of them have tried to flee to the United States. And he was playing, and I think I've got the details of this right. David will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was with the US national team, the Cuban national team, playing an international in the US in about 2007 when he was only 21 years of age. And he seized the chance and defected. He defected in the middle of a Walmart supermarket. He managed to escape from the people sort of guarding his party and sought political asylum. And since has forged a very successful career in Major League Soccer. He was with Seattle for 10 years. And then he signed for Minnesota, who are managed by Adrian Heath, who was a great player with Everton in his days, in the pre-Premier League days. He signed for them at the start of last season. They built a new stadium because they were new to the league. He scored the first goal in it, thunderbolt of a volley. And he is probably one of the best defensive midfield players that Major League Soccer has seen, and continues to be going strong at the age of 34. And he's due to play tonight in the playoff semi-final for Minnesota United against Sporting Kansas City. Great name, very American name. So he's still very much an influence and one of the archetypal players that's helped in the development of MLS.
Wow, it's true. You're a genius, John. I don't know how you have everything on your fingertips. It's amazing. So let's talk about where you've commentated. That is in the World Cup, English Premier League, Cup games, Champions League, MLS. So many. Oh my goodness, John, you have this is your CV. Your CV is like this infinity CV. So is there a team, player, match? I know most people want to know in the Champions League, in the English Premier League, a team that has stood out for you over the years, a player that when you just think about that player, like, wow, that was a really good player.
Yeah, there are a few iconic Premier League players that stick with me. I mean, it's difficult to go beyond Alan Shearer as the record Premier League goal scorer, 260 goals. At one time, it seemed like every week we were at St James's Park, and every week I was shouting, Shearer! Away with his arm up in the air with the typical celebration that was the same every time. Thierry Henry was magnificent to watch. I mentioned Matthew Le Tissier, who's probably less garlanded, but was a genius of a player with Southampton in the early years of the Premier League. And I'm inevitably going to leave out a host of players who have done wonderful things, but they were the ones that made a big impact on me. I suppose Harry Kane now, more recently. We're seeing with Liverpool's development into something resembling what they used to be, which was the best side in the country, the best side in Europe, and arguably in club football, the best side around the world. We're seeing a lot of wonderful things there, and Mohamed Salah is just so admirable in so many ways. And Van Dijk is, I think, the best central defender in the world when he's fit. So the Premier League at every stage has had players to look at and think, crumbs, I'm so lucky to be watching you on a regular basis. So lucky to be commentating on you and reflecting some of these great moments, because commentary of great moments inevitably sounds better, whether the commentary is great or not, because people generally judge a piece of commentary on the actual moment that you're describing rather than the commentary itself. They may not realize they're doing that. So it kind of makes our jobs rather easier if you're observing great moments on a weekly basis and all you've got to do is shout about them.
Yes. So Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp, or Jose Mourinho? Choose one.
To do what, Shon? To win a one-off title, to win a one-off game, or to build a club over many years?
To build a club. I know who you will say if I say to build a club over across many. Okay, yeah. To win a most anticipated match. Okay.
To win a most... Do you know, I'd probably go Mourinho on a one-off basis for a one-off game, because I think he's the man with the plan. But if you're asking me the best of those, if I was the chairman of a club and I wanted, in the Premier League, and I wanted to appoint a manager out of the three names that you've mentioned, I would say Jurgen Klopp. Because I think you don't just need the tactical acumen. These days you need a personality, and you need some warmth and someone that's going to connect with the fans. And I think he does that better than the other two.
But how many clubs in the Premier League are patient? Because Liverpool were patient with Klopp.
Yeah, they
before
were.
he did it. Yeah.
And going back a generation, Manchester United were patient with Ferguson. I'm old enough to remember covering Manchester United in the midst of dreadful runs and having to do the post-match interview with Ferguson and ask him whether he was planning to resign because things were going so badly. And Manchester United were patient with him, and look what happened over the ensuing 25 plus years. So there is a lesson in there, but you're right. Not many clubs are that patient. We're seeing that with Arteta at Arsenal at the moment. They have a bad turn, and suddenly there are questions about him. Will the Arsenal board understand the American owner be strong enough to withstand that? I would hope that they would be. But yes, patience is in short supply in the Premier League. I mean, I think Manchester City have been patient with Guardiola because I don't think
they have
on their investment in him has necessarily been as bountiful as they expected. Certainly not to this point.
Because you have to agree that they brought him for the big cup and he hasn't managed to get it. That is the UEFA Champions League. So, but you have also with this generation, as you had said earlier, social media plays a lot into it because even yesterday, just a normal Champions League game. After that, you see Ole out trending, Arteta out trending when Arsenal lose. It's crazy. I think so much pressure for the managers and also the players involved, John.
Yeah, and this is no slight on social media, but that shouldn't matter. That shouldn't weigh on the decisions of these multimillionaires and billionaires that own the clubs. They have advice all around them. They don't need to look at their phone and their notifications to see what people are really thinking. They should be able to make decisions themselves with their own experience and their own financial interest in the situation as well, frankly. So it rather saddens me when I see people bowing to trends on social media, because it's so easy. If you're a Manchester United fan after yesterday's result, just to say, right, Solskjaer's rubbish, Solskjaer out, get rid of Ollie. That's so short-sighted. I mean, I do think I have reservations over whether he is long-term the man to restore Manchester United to their former glories. But those reservations are also wrapped up in the current ownership of the club and the executive level of the club, and whether they have the right people in place, whoever the manager is. Because they've had some good ones in there since no one could call Louis van Gaal an idiot that doesn't know what he's doing, but he found it very difficult in that situation going in.
True, I agree. And what is your most memorable moment from the World Cup and the UEFA Champions League?
Okay, UEFA Champions League. I think, the finals are all great fun, but some of the comebacks, some of the unlikely comebacks. So Spurs, a couple of seasons ago, with their most unlikely of comebacks. I remember doing Newcastle fans still talk to me about a game I did back in the 1990s when Asprilla and company were playing for them, and Craig Bellamy. And I did a game where it was when the Champions League had two group stages, which it did for 2 or 3 years. And they got through the first group stage, and the second group stage, they'd lost their first 3 games. And Newcastle became the first team ever, having lost their first 3 games, to go through by winning their second 3 games of this group stage. And the critical game was in Feyenoord, in De Kuip in Rotterdam. Wonderful arena, very noisy and atmospheric, wooden floors in the stands, so the supporters stamped their feet to generate the noise. And they were 2 goals down in this game, and they came back to win with a very late goal by Craig Bellamy, 3-2. And I know it's not a particularly high-profile Champions League story, but that just, for me, sums up the appeal of what's possible in the Champions League. So that one stays with me. In terms of the World Cup, best game, I'd say, would be England-Argentina in 1998. Michael Owen's wonder goal. David Beckham was sent off. England battled through to extra time and penalties with 10 men and then lost, as they usually do, in the shootout. But that game had everything. And it was also, for me, it was an integral part of the launching of David Beckham's career, because iconic players don't just need to be brilliant at what they do. They need a little bit of infamy along the way. They need some bad news sprinkled in. And that red card was part of his infamy and helped, I think, launch him to even greater stardom. And in terms of wider World Cup experiences, seeing South Korea get to the semi-final in 2002 and being in those stadiums, which were just a sea of red-clad spectators and bobbing up and down in unison, and echoed really at the last World Cup in Russia. And when I set up for that World Cup, I didn't expect to have that experience of seeing Russia have such a good run, of being at some of their games and seeing that similar feeling of a nation right behind its team, which you so rarely get. That will live with me forever. So those are my World Cup memories that stay with me, and some bad ones as well. I mean, the sad passing of Maradona. I remember being at the game in the United States when, in 1994, and this is a sad memory, when he was fueled by drugs, he scored a goal and he ran. And I'm sure you remember the pictures of him looking manically with staring eyes down the barrel of the camera lens. And the next day, the news broke that he failed a drug test. So there are sad memories as well from World Cups. And that was one of those that came to my mind last week when I heard the news about his tragic passing at the age of just 60.
Yeah. May his soul rest in peace. Now, a huge difference that you've seen while you're commentating is what is happening on the pitch. A few years ago, no VAR, but people used to complain all the time, oh, not a fair game, it was an unfair decision. And then, FIFA was like, okay, we're going to try and sort this out. Introduction of the VAR, the complaining is still there. It's very controversial day in, day out. And especially when this happens in the world's best football league, that is the English Premier League, when you see this week in, week out. What are your thoughts on the VAR, John?
Okay, I don't want to say I told you so, but if you go back and look at any interviews I was doing 3 years ago when we were thinking, what's it going to be like when we have VAR, I was saying that I wasn't a fan of it. Because I think that one of the joys of football and why we all love it so much is that it is at every level a game wrapped up in human frailty, whether that's the frailty of the players, the spectators, or the referee. And so many barroom conversations over the years, post-match amongst fans, are wrapped up in the perceived mistakes of the referee. Often not mistakes, but just decisions that have gone away that that particular fan of that particular club doesn't like. So I have an issue with VAR on that level, in that I think it's taking away that level of human frailty, which is an integral part of the appeal of the sport. But I accept that it's here. I think what we've lost is what clear and obvious is. So the reason that FIFA decided that VAR needed to come in was to deal with the clearest and most heinous mistakes. So I'm thinking of Thierry Henry's handball in a World Cup playoff, which arguably cost Ireland a place at those World Cup finals and sent France there in their place, in the Stade de France back nearly 10 years ago. And the Swedish referee, Martin Hansen, just didn't see it and so couldn't give it. Now, VAR is ideal for things like that. But then we come to a situation where, I don't know whether you remember the Premier League game last weekend between Brighton and Liverpool, where Danny Welbeck was challenged in the area. His boot was clipped by an opponent's boot. And the camera panned away. No one appealed, not even Welbeck, who we later learned had been fouled. And it goes to VAR, and they give a penalty. And I just think that's wrong, because VAR is trying to apply a finite rule to a game that is not finite. Football is by nature an approximate sport in most respects. You could argue about offside, but it's subjective. It's one person's opinion on a decision, and you can't objectify subjective decisions. So I've got a real issue with that. I think, strangely, we benefit in the United States. So Howard Webb, the former World Cup final referee, is in charge of refereeing for Major League Soccer. He lives over here just outside New York City. And because we have fewer cameras here, so usually for a game we might have 10 cameras, for the English Premier League we'll have 25, they can't be as precise. And so Howard has said to his officials, remember, clear and obvious. If you're debating whether to review something, don't, because if you're having to think, is it worth reviewing? It's not, because it's not clear and obvious. And because you don't have as many camera angles, you don't have these endless stoppages. So they'll look at something, say an offside, they're not drawing lines on the pitch and then getting the crosshairs out, which are those things like this that come out in 5% of the cases in the Premier League, and we get a 3 or 4 or 5 minute stoppage, which completely ruins the flow of the game. They're taking a couple of looks at the available angles, thinking, is that clear and obvious? If it is, they'll go with it. If it's not, get on with the game. And I just think that the Premier League in particular has lost its way, because this notion of what is clear, what is obvious, what is worth intervening on has just been lost. And they're trying to re-referee everything, and that's not what it's for. And it saddens me, and I hope eventually that Mike Riley and the team at Stockley Park will get the message that this is not what the fans want. And indeed, it's not necessarily what FIFA are demanding. They're taking it a stage further.
And you can also see it's taking a toll on the players, because immediately in the post-match interviews, they keep on, they're like, a player, I remember I was watching this past weekend, And they kept on saying they don't even know now what the rules are, especially, with the handball.
Yes.
Or the offside. They don't even know what the rules are anymore. So let's see. And it's destroying the
rules for an analog age, which are being applied in a digital fashion. So these are, the handball rule is pretty clear with the shoulder line of the T-shirt, as they now say. But we're applying it in an age where you can slow things down to the nth degree, and you've got 25 different angles. And from those 25, you can prove virtually anything if you want to with those different angles. I just think we're in danger of losing ourselves when you get a player like Danny Welbeck, who is fouled, the pictures show, but actually is surprised to be told that he's just won a penalty. That can't be right. Players know if they've been genuinely fouled and are deserving of a penalty. And you'll see that reaction in the way they harangue officials. It can't be right when you are surprised to be awarded a penalty.
Very true. And before we just go on to the last question, let me take one comment and one question from the viewer. So one comment, Mulemi Gregory says, John is one of the best we've had in the business, an icon, of course. Now, let me just take one question, John, from the fans. I'm just checking on my phone. Do you ever make mistakes, John, during commentary? And if yes, how do you recover from that?
Always. I think we all do. Hopefully you don't notice most of them, but I think the only way to deal with it if you make a mistake is to own up to it as quickly as possible, because people, if you make a bad mistake, people will notice. I think the best thing is just to say, look, players make mistakes, referees make mistakes. We don't have our version of VAR. Our job is a bit like walking a tightrope without a safety net, and occasionally we will fall off. Sorry.
Okay, John. What is your advice to upcoming commentators in the industry?
It's a great job. Enjoy it, but you're not the star. The game is the star. So if you're wanting to, there's a big difference between radio commentary and TV commentary. If you're a radio commentator, your job is to paint pictures. You can use all sorts of outlandish language. You can be impressionistic if you wish. If you're a TV commentator, it's a bit like putting a straitjacket on, because 95% of your job is done by those 25 cameras around the pitch. So you've got to be much more restrained and only speak occasionally, and don't try and impose yourself on the spectacle, because your words will never be more powerful than the visual images. All you can look to do is augment and guide the viewer and make them feel comfortable.
Wonderful. Your message to the Kenyan fans who love you and follow your work?
That I would love to come and visit Kenya one day. I'm aware of the depth of feeling for the Premier League in particular in Kenya, and I'd love to sample it at first hand, and maybe find myself in a bar in Nairobi actually watching a Premier League game with a few of you at one stage as well.
Yes, it will happen soon. Oh, and which football team do you support, John? I know you had said York.
Yeah, York. That's my team. I genuinely do not have a Premier League team, because for me, you only have one team, and I grew up half a mile from York City's ground. In my time supporting them, I've either seen or commentated on them beating Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, and Chelsea. So even if you support a small team, every dog has its day, and you enjoy it even more when it happens because you're not used to success. Yes, we've had a lot of downs, and we're in the 6th division at the moment. But yeah, that's always been my team, and I will only accept supporters having one team. Very important.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, John, for making the time to come talk to us and talk to your Kenyan fans. This has been amazing. And I hope all the local commentators who have been watching have actually gotten something out of this. I know you've motivated so many people, including I was telling you, my former boss, that is Toro Meturike. I know he is still a huge fan of you, and so many other commentators across the country. I hope they have learned something from this. So when you go back to the UK, please pass our greetings and love to Peter Drury and also Jim Begling. And don't forget to update us. I will put it on Twitter, the matches you'll be doing, so people can get to, I know they want to hear you say some of this wonderful Premier League news, and all the best in the MLS. And yes, I know the MLS is wrapping up, but there's also still more. The football world is growing, and we have all these things, UEFA Nations League. We have something popping in and out all the time from, UEFA, FIFA. People are working hard to make money. They're broadcasters. So anyway, thank you so much for doing this, John, and have a lovely time.
John, it's been a great pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed reliving lots of memories. We're all very lucky to be involved in the Premier League or to follow it in one way or another. And thank you for the warmth of your welcome, and just what I say to everyone at the moment, and people say to me, please stay safe.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you for watching.